Darkness. Complete, total darkness. Not the kind you get when you close your eyes. Not the kind of darkness you feel in a room with the lights off. This is something else. This is a darkness that presses against your face. A darkness that has weight. A darkness that is closing in inch by inch with every second that passes. Now, imagine you cannot move your arms. You cannot lift your legs. You cannot sit up. The ceiling above you is not a ceiling. It is dirt. Packed, heavy, cold Texas dirt, and you are underneath it, alive. That is where Tiffany Brown found herself one October night in the state of Texas. Buried, underground, left to die by someone she thought she knew, left in a hole that was meant to be her grave, and for a few hours it was. But Tiffany Brown did not die that night. She crawled, she clawed, she screamed into the silence, and somehow, impossibly, she came back. This is her story, and it is one of the most terrifying survival stories this country has ever seen. Before we go into what happened inside that grave, you need to understand what it means to be buried alive. Not in a movie way, not in a dramatic Hollywood way, in a real, physical, scientific way. Because when you understand what the human body goes through underground, the story hits different. When you are sealed underground in a confined space, the oxygen runs out faster than most people realize. Depending on the size of the box or the depth of the hole, a person can lose breathable air in under an hour. Carbon dioxide builds up. Your lungs start to burn. Your brain starts to panic before you even consciously register what is happening. Your heart rate spikes. Your body starts sweating even in the cold. And then the claustrophobia kicks in. That deep, primal terror that is wired into every human being. The terror of being trapped. The terror of having no way out. Scientists call it taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. And for centuries, it was so common that wealthy families paid for coffins with bells attached to strings so that if someone woke up underground, they could ring for help. That is how real this fear is. That is how many people have faced this exact situation throughout history. And that is exactly where Tiffany Brown found herself. Except she had no bell, she had no box. She had nothing but dirt and darkness and the thin, desperate thread of her own will to live. Tiffany Brown was 33 years old when her world fell apart in the most unimaginable way. She lived in East Texas, in a small community where everybody knew everybody, or at least thought they did. She was a mother. She had people who loved her. She had a laugh that people remembered. She was, by all accounts, a woman who had faced hard times but kept pushing through. Life in rural Texas is not always easy. Economic pressures, complicated relationships, the kind of slow grind that wears people down over time. But Tiffany was the kind of person who kept her chin up, the kind of woman who looked for the light even when things got dark, which makes what happened to her all the more devastating, because the darkness that came for her that October was not poverty. It was not illness. It was not an accident. It was a person. A person who had made a calculated, cold, and deliberate decision to end her life and put her in the ground. His name was Ricky Pierce, and if you had seen him on the street, you would not have flinched. That is the thing about predators. The most dangerous ones never look dangerous. They look ordinary. They look like your neighbor. They look like someone's uncle. They look like someone who would hold the door open for you at the grocery store. Ricky Pierce was a man Tiffany had a relationship with. A man she was entangled with in the way that small town lives often get entangled. Complicated history, complicated feelings, the kind of situation that is hard to explain to outsiders but makes complete sense when you are living inside it. She trusted him, at least partially, and that trust was the door he walked through. In the days leading up to the attack, there were signs. There are always signs, in hindsight, a shift in energy, a tension that could not quite be named. Words said with an edge that felt slightly off. Tiffany might have noticed something was different. Or maybe she did not. Maybe the change was so subtle, so carefully masked, that by the time she realized something was wrong, it was already too late. That is the cruel architecture of violence between people who know each other. It does not announce itself. It slides in quietly. It makes you doubt your own instincts. And then one night, in the dark, somewhere in the East Texas woods, Ricky Pierce made his move. The details of what led to that moment are disturbing, and they are real. There was a confrontation. There was violence. Tiffany was beaten, incapacitated, and then driven to a location in the woods. A location that Ricky had prepared. He had dug a hole. Think about that for a moment. He had gone out into the Texas woods and dug a hole in the ground, a grave. Before the night even began, he had already decided she was going to die. This was not a moment of rage. This was not a spontaneous act. This was premeditated. This was planned. This was a man who looked at a woman and decided she did not deserve to exist, and then made arrangements accordingly. Tiffany was placed in that hole. She was covered, and Ricky Pierce walked away. He walked away from a living woman in the ground, and he went home. He went to sleep. Or maybe he didn't sleep. Maybe he lay awake, convinced that he had finally done something that could not be undone. Either way, he left her there, in the dark, underground, in October, in Texas, where the nights are cool and the woods are quiet, and nobody would hear a thing. Now we go underground, because this is where the story becomes something that most of us cannot even begin to imagine. Tiffany was conscious, or she became conscious, in the dark, buried under the earth. Her brain came back online, and what came with consciousness was panic. Raw, animal panic. The kind that does not come from the thinking brain. The kind that comes from the oldest part of the human mind. The part that screams run, run, run even when there is nowhere to run. Her heart would have been hammering. Her breathing would have been fast and shallow. And fast, shallow breathing in a low oxygen environment burns through what little air you have even faster. This is the terrible math of being buried alive. The more you panic, the faster you die. Surviving underground is not about physical strength in those first moments. It is about the mind. It is about doing something that goes against every screaming instinct in your body. It is about slowing down, breathing slow, thinking slow. And Tiffany somehow found a way to do exactly that. Maybe it was her children she thought of. Maybe it was some deep, wordless refusal to let this be the end. Maybe it was pure biological survival instinct kicking in at the cellular level. Whatever it was, it held her together when everything around her was trying to break her apart. She started to move. In the dirt. In the dark. She started to push. Now, here is what most people do not understand about being buried. If the soil is not packed tightly, if it has been freshly dug and loosely replaced, there is a possibility of movement. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. And Tiffany pushed against the earth above her. She pushed with her hands, her arms, her shoulders. Every movement cost oxygen. Every movement was agony. Every movement was a gamble. Because if the dirt above her shifted wrong, if it collapsed in instead of giving way, it would be over. But she pushed anyway. She pushed because the alternative was lying still and waiting to suffocate in silence. And Tiffany Brown was not built for silence. The physical act of clawing out of a grave is something that tears skin, breaks nails, strains muscles to their absolute limits. Dirt gets into the mouth, into the eyes, into the throat. It is suffocating in a different way, a tactile way, the sensation of being smothered by the earth itself. And yet Tiffany moved, inches at a time, working against gravity, against weight, against the crushing press of the ground above her. At some point in that terrible darkness, her hand broke through. Just her hand, just fingers reaching up into the cold Texas night air. And that small, impossible moment, that single breath of cold air on her fingertips, must have felt like the entire world. She kept going. She had to. Getting one hand out is not survival. It is just the beginning of survival. She had to pull the rest of herself out of that grave. And she did. Slowly, painfully, in the dark, in the cold, covered in dirt and blood and the evidence of what had been done to her. Tiffany Brown pulled herself out of the ground. She stood up in the woods, disoriented, injured, not knowing exactly where she was, but alive, standing, breathing, choosing to fight. What comes next in survival situations is often overlooked in true crime stories, because we are so focused on the horror of what happened that we forget the ordinary miracle of what comes after. Tiffany was in the woods at night, in an unknown location, with no phone, possibly injured in ways she could not fully assess. She had to move. She had to find civilization. She had to get to someone who could help before her attacker came back, before her injuries caught up with her, before her body finally surrendered. So she walked through the dark Texas woods, scratched and bleeding and shaking. She walked toward anything that looked like light, like road, like human presence, and eventually, she found it. When Tiffany Brown was discovered by first responders, she was in a state that shocked even experienced emergency personnel, covered in dirt, visibly traumatized. Injuries consistent with severe assault and the physical ordeal of clawing through soil. But she was talking. She was conscious. And the first thing she did was tell them what happened. She told them about Ricky Pierce. She told them about the hole in the ground. She gave them enough that law enforcement could move, and move fast. Ricky Pierce was arrested. When investigators went to the site in the woods, they found it. The hole. The evidence of what had been done there, and the case against Pierce began to build into something undeniable. A woman had been beaten, buried alive, and left to die. And somehow, she had come back. And now she was sitting in a hospital bed, alive, talking to detectives, and making sure that the man who put her in the ground was going to face what he had done. The legal aftermath was exactly what you would expect, given the severity of the crime. Ricky Pierce was charged with attempted murder. The case drew attention not just locally, but across the state of Texas, because the specific horror of being buried alive is something that grips people in a way that is hard to explain. It touches something prehistoric in all of us. That fear of the earth closing over us. That fear of darkness and weight and no way out. And here was a real woman who had lived through it. And she was still standing. Tiffany's recovery was not simple. Physical injuries take time, but the psychological weight of what she experienced is something that cannot be measured in hospital discharge papers. Surviving something like that changes the architecture of a person's mind. You do not come back from being buried alive and simply return to normal. The dark means something different. Enclosed spaces carry a new language. Sleep is complicated in ways it was not before. Survivors of extreme trauma carry it in the body, in the nervous system, in those split-second moments when something triggers a memory and the brain floods with all of it again. Tiffany Brown survived. But surviving is not the same as being unaffected. It is not the same as being free. It is its own long, complicated journey. What her story gives the rest of us is something valuable, though. Something worth sitting with. Because Tiffany's survival was not luck. Not entirely. Luck played a role, yes. The looseness of the soil. The position she was placed in. But the central engine of her survival was her own mind. Her decision, conscious or not, to not fully surrender. Her ability to slow her breathing when every instinct screamed to gasp. Her willingness to push against the earth when pushing seemed impossible. Her refusal to accept that the hole in the ground was the last chapter of her story. That was not luck. That was something else. Something that lives inside human beings that we rarely get to see, because most of the time, we never need it. A reserve of will and fight, and absolute refusal that sits quietly inside all of us. Waiting. Tiffany Brown found hers in the dark, underground, alone, and it brought her back. Cases like this also force us to look at the patterns of intimate partner violence in a way that is uncomfortable but necessary. Ricky Pierce did not snap. He did not lose control in a moment of passion and do something he would spend years regretting. He dug a hole. Before the night even started. The planning involved in what he did speaks to a level of cold calculation that is chilling in its implications. And yet to people around him, he was ordinary. Which is the thing that true crime stories like this one keep showing us. Over and over and over again. Violence does not always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it wears a familiar one. Sometimes it knows your name. Sometimes it has your phone number. Sometimes it has a key to your house. The most dangerous threat in a person's life is frequently not a stranger in an alley. It is someone already inside their world. The numbers bear this out in ways that should make every one of us pay attention. Tiffany's story made news. It was covered by regional outlets and eventually picked up nationally because the specific facts of it are so extreme that they demand attention. A woman buried alive in Texas woods, escaping by her own strength, surviving to testify against her attacker. There is something almost mythic about it. But it is not myth. It is documented. It happened. There is a real woman with real scars who lived this. And that realness is exactly why it matters. Because it is easy to treat true crime as entertainment. It is easy to consume these stories with the comfortable distance of someone watching through a screen. But Tiffany Brown is not a character. She is a person who took a breath of cold Texas night air through fingers that had just broken through the soil of her own grave. And that is something that should sit with you. The questions her survival leaves behind are not simple ones. How do we recognize the warning signs before it gets to this point? How do we build systems, communities, networks of support that catch people before they are in a hole in the ground? How do we talk about intimate partner violence in a way that actually moves the needle, that actually changes outcomes, that actually saves lives? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are questions worth asking every single time. And then there is the personal question, the one that Tiffany's story makes unavoidable, the one that this kind of survival story plants in the back of your mind long after you stop listening. What would you have done? In the dark, underground, no air, no light, no one coming. What would you have reached for? What would have kept you pushing against the earth? What is the thing inside you that would have refused to let go? That is not a comfortable question, but it is an important one, because somewhere in the answer to that question lives the most honest version of who you are. And sometimes, in the most terrible moments, that version of yourself is the only thing standing between you and the dark. Tiffany Brown found out what she was made of in a way that no one should ever have to. She found it in the most brutal classroom imaginable. And she passed. She came up out of the ground and she walked through the dark Texas woods, and she made sure the man who buried her never got to bury anyone else. She is still here, breathing, a mother, a survivor, a woman who once had only cold dirt and her own heartbeat for company, and chose to keep that heartbeat going no matter what it cost. Remember her name, because the next time life puts you underground in whatever way life does that to people, and it will, it always does, you might need to remember that someone once did the impossible. Someone once clawed through the earth with bare hands and broken nails and came out the other side. Someone once proved that the will to survive can be stronger than the weight of the world pressing down on you. Her name is Tiffany Brown, and she is alive.